Okay, here we are getting ready to discuss the understimulated type. So these are people that are exhausted, they're burnt out, they're tired, there's no gas in the tank. They have major problems with depression. They need to take daily naps. Excuse me one second here. They can't exercise, they cry easily, they have a low pain tolerance, they avoid social settings, and potentially there's frequent miscarriages and difficulty getting pregnant. And they know about this thing called MTHFR, and they're putting all the puzzle pieces together, or at least trying to put these puzzle pieces together, and they're not getting the answers that they need to. So that's what we want to talk about today. John will be joining me shortly, and we will be talking about this particular genetic type. If you haven't had a chance to go and take the mini course, make sure you go and do that. It's at yourgenetictype.com, and there is a free resource, and it's our mini course to understand what your genetic type is. You'll take some questionnaires and you'll understand what your main genetic type is, and it will help organize this information in a way that's a lot more digestible. It's not so difficult to take on the task of understanding all of these gene SNPs, these polymorphisms that will give us a lot of information. So John, how you doing over there?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm doing awesome. So I was just giving an introduction here. Let me make my volume go a little bit louder. I was just giving an introduction here on this particular genetic type where people are exhausted. There's not a lot of gas in the tank. They're lacking the motivation and inability to exercise and needing to nap daily. How much of a percentage of your patient base do you see people like this?
Quite a bit. Pretty much everybody that comes in, one of the biggest complaints they have is, energy aspects and mood components. And we know there's a lot of, epigenetic factors that cause that, infections, chemical components, things of that nature. But, there is this understimulated genetic type that people have. And, we're talking about the understimulated type. One of the key genes that's in that is the MTHFR. And so that is one of the genes that is relevant in somebody who is that understimulated type, because they could have impairment in methylation activity. And basically what I call it is they just can't put enough gas in the tank day in, day out because of some weakened enzymatic activity and how they can, make the ingredients or make the chemistry to be able to fuel the system day in, day out.
Yeah, and this comes back to the traditional way that people look at their gene SNPs. They do a 23andMe, or they know about something called MTHFR. Their doctor runs a blood test and only looks at the one gene SNP, which in and of itself can be a daunting task because there's so many other interactions and synergistic impact that all genes have to have. But in general, if someone does have that MTHFR challenge, they are going to have some potential challenges with this particular genetic type. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the thing is, when we're talking about the 7 core genetic types, the MTHFR, component can play into all of them at some level, but from a core standpoint, typically that where somebody's MTHFR is the is a primary player, meaning that, all right, there's not bigger fish in the sea. Typically, those are the people that fall into this understimulated type where MTHFR is a priority, where they're just not able to methylate, they're not able to make enough neurotransmitters, that they're not enough, they're not able to make enough antioxidants for an immune response, and so MTHFR can become a big priority in those people that are that understimulated type.
Yeah, so so I guess we can maybe talk a little bit about this then, so that we can help bridge the gap on what they're doing, because there's a lot of groups out there, the MTHFR epigenetic group, and people are looking on the web. They've seen Dr. Lynch and they've done a lot of searching on their own, and in part, this is why we came up with your genetic type, to make things a lot easier. So maybe talk about, I have the PowerPoint presentation we could bring up, but in general though, maybe talk about how we approach this differently when we are able to put it into a nice organized fashion, John, where people have these particular gene SNPs? What would be the understimulated type gene SNPs that they might be looking at? And then what do they do about it?
Right. So in the understimulated type, we have, a couple core genetic, some core genes that we look at. We look at some of the baseline genes that deal with methylation activity, which is the MTHFR, and also some other genes that deal with methylation, that deal with B12, specifically MTR, methionine synthase. And thing is, a lot of times people, get so kind of honed into just MTHFR by itself and realize that in our methylation pathway, there is more than just MTHFR. So the understimulated genes deal with some of these genes in our methylation pathway, like MTHFR, MTR, but they also deal with a couple other key genes that, play into other methylation components. For instance, one of the genes we look at is a gene called DHFR, which is a gene that is in our, is our folate pathway, but deals with bioptin recycling. And so when you're talking about bioptin, you're talking about the body's ability to take, vitamin B9 and methylation activity to be able to make neurotransmitters. And so a lot of times fatigue can set in, and energy and expenditure can set in from a neurochemical side of things. We also look at enzymes in the understimulated type, such as the SHMT, which deals with glycine recycling and the body's ability to make glutathione and the body's ability to make things like folinic acid. BHMT, which deals with homocysteine recycling, which can be a big factor in really kind of impairing or kind of bogging down our methylation cycle. Because if you can't recycle, homocysteine, your methylation cycles are going to be impaired at some level. And then the other genes we look at are genes that make enzymes that are responsible for regulating things like dopamine, regulating things like serotonin levels. And so what we see in somebody that's understimulated, they have fatigue aspects, but they also kind of fall into maybe a depressed state because they can have what we call a fast working COMT or fast working MAOA, where they are basically just clearing out their neurochemistry at a rapid rate, which then leaves them with no neurotransmitters in the tank day in, day out, which kind of leaves them in more of a depressed or fatigued state just because the neurochemistry is not there.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction, John, because a lot of people who are doing this work on their own or seeing providers that help them out with the puzzle, they understand the idea that gene SNPs are lanes of highways. And as we talk about a lot, instead of an 8-lane highway, you have a 4-lane highway, or you have a 2-lane highway if it's heterozygous, one parent gave you the copy, or two parents homozygous. But in this case, we're talking about like a 12-lane highway, right? In terms of having quick clearance. And so maybe explain that, because I know a lot of people get confused on, say they look at an organic acid test and they don't understand, well, I don't have a lot in there, or I have too much in there. So explain that to them and what that means in terms of clearing something out too quickly and why that would make you understimulated.
Yeah, so when you're talking about looking at, neurotransmitter metabolites that deal with, specifically dopamine clearance, for instance, you can look at those metabolite markers to give you good insight into, is your COMT or MAOA working fast or slow, which can kind of give you an insight like, okay, is this understimulated type kind of confirmed through laboratory testing? Now, in an understimulated type, you can have both. You can have low dopamine metabolites or high dopamine metabolites. Because if you got problems with MTHFR, methylation activity, you got problems making the chemistry in the first place, well, then those metabolite markers are going to be low because you just can't put enough gas in the tank. But where the fast COMT and the fast MAO genes come into play is when you start seeing those VMA and HVA levels on an organic acids test that are very, very elevated, which means that, hey, you're putting plenty of gas in the tank from a neurotransmitter standpoint, but you are just rapidly breaking it down, causing those metabolites to be on the higher end, which is a huge factor for somebody that's got, depression issues, focus issues, brain fog components, energy aspects, things of that nature. And so really what's great is there's a lot of debate still on the gene locations that deal with fast and slow COMT, fast or slow O genes, but you can look at an organic acids test and give you a whole lot of insight of what's going on there in terms of how fast or how slow you're clearing your neurochemistry. And the thing is if you've got elevated HVA or VMA levels on organic acids, if you don't know what that means, that's all right. But basically what that means is you're breaking down your dopamine and your brain chemistry at a rapid rate. That does give you a whole lot of insight into why you feel the way you feel. And so then you got to, get to work determining how do you slow that process down. Are there genetic factors where you're pushing certain, B vitamins and nutrients a little too aggressively that's causing those enzymes to work even faster? Are there epigenetic factors that are causing those enzymes to work at a higher rapid rate, like Clostridium bacteria or chemicals or whatever it may be? But at least that, hey, I've connected the dots in terms of I'm depressed, or, I've got massive brain fog or focus issues, and you see these elevated metabolite issues in the neurochemistry section or neurotransmitter section of organic acids, and you've also got a lot of mutations in COMT or MAO genes. It tells you, yes, there's a genetic predisposition where instead of having a normal 8-lane highway, you've got a 12 or 30-lane highway. So you've got a higher genetic predisposition for your body to really rapidly clear those neurochemicals, which then leaves you with nothing in the tank, and then hence the symptoms you experience day in, day out.
Yeah, it does. That's where it gets to be complex, John. And I think that's where we get back into, hey, listen, we think that there's 7 core genetic types. We have this pyramid here. And depending on what your symptoms are and what your gene SNPs are, which we lay out very nicely for people, these would be the clusters of types that we think you have. And that would be, in this case, we're talking about an understimulated type. Then once you get to learn what the genes that are relevant, like we just talked about in this particular genetic type, do I have the polymorphism, then what would be the ideal test that we would run? And in this instance, we talked about having a organic acid test. And then also potentially we know about some of the nuances of what epigenetic or lifestyle or cars on the highway factors that would slow or cause problems with those highways and create a perfect storm. What other tests can we run, like a GI map test for looking at the microbial support? You mentioned about Clostridia, or even organic acid testing would show that as well. So maybe, I know we want to do a talk on the role of heavy metals at some point. Maybe that will be our next one. But maybe talk about, for people that are starting to get some of these concepts that we're talking about, just how important the epigenetic factors are in determining how your symptoms would play out.
Okay. So the first part of that, from a testing standpoint, you can look at organic acids tests, but one of the big tests that I usually will have a lot of patients of mine run that we recommend, if somebody falls into this understimulated type, where they've got symptoms of an understimulated type person and they have a lot of genetic variants in these genes listed here, this is where a methylation pathway test comes in great, because it'll really show you, where is the biggest factor in your methionine cycle, your methylation cycle. Where's the biggest breakdown? Because we're talking about some of the genes listed here. You're talking about MTHFR, MTR, BHMT aspects. Typically, somebody that is an understimulated type is going to have abnormal homocysteine levels, and so you want to figure out, besides, homocysteine levels being abnormal, where is the biggest factor in that methylation or methionine cycle, taking place, because then how you can really start addressing it from a supportive standpoint more aggressively. So that is a big key test for people that are the understimulated type, and you can even get into more advanced things, looking at like folate pathways and things of that nature. But organic acids to really confirm the COMT or MAOA, and then also looking at a methylation profile test to look at the first genes listed there that really shows you the impairment in the methionine cycle. Now, talking about the epigenetic factors with this, we know that there are certain stressors that really gravitate towards specific genes more so. And when we're talking about an understimulated type, one of the biggest stressors you mentioned is, we're going to do a talk maybe next week on heavy metals. Okay. And heavy metals is a huge component in the understimulated type, because where heavy metals really can put a lot of traffic on that highway. And if you don't understand the highway concept, I definitely, strongly encourage you to list some other things we've done, or get our genetic type unlock course, because it really talks about that. Because if you can understand the concept of how many lanes do you have available in your biochemistry versus how much traffic is on the highway, you really can get a good understanding of how to address things at a different level. But when we're talking about metals, we're talking about putting more traffic on the highway. And one thing that traffic really disrupts in an understimulated person is the Mthr gene, methionine synthase, which deals with the body's ability to take methylfolate and methylcobalamin, so vitamin B9 and vitamin B12, and be able to methylate, okay, to be able to make SAMe, to make neurotransmitters, to make DNA and RNA, to make antioxidants. There's a whole lot of research on mercury. There's a whole lot of research on aluminum, okay, on lead, as being huge disruptors for methionine synthase. And then what we see is, along with that, is we see certain conditions that really tie into heavy metals and methionine synthase mutations, things like Alzheimer's, things like kids on the spectrum. Okay, so we know that heavy metals are huge factors in those components, but why they're factors is because it really can bog down and put a lot of traffic on methylation activity. And where it puts the biggest stress is by slowing down your Mthr genes, whether you have genetic mutations or not. All right, what it does is, if you have an 8-lane highway, which is normal, or if you have a 2-lane highway, which is abnormal, it puts thousands and thousands of cars on the road and really puts a lot of stress in your body's ability to methylate. And so one thing that you want to consider is looking for the sources of where heavy metal burden is coming from, whether it be a mouthful of amalgams or previous exposure it may be, but then also talking about how to optimize your pathways by supporting things like this understimulated type. And then maybe even taking it to the next level and doing moderate but very safe detox protocols and start kind of squeezing and eliminating that stored burden on your body.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome stuff, John. The real take-home message on that is that these epigenetics or car accidents or heavy metals, in this case, on the highway, whether the highway is 2 lanes, 4 lanes, or 12 lanes, it's still going to cause a major slowdown. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important for people to understand, because that means don't eliminate the particular gene SNP if it's not polymorphic or doesn't have a plus minus or plus plus for yourself. But that's why we organize this in this way, so that you can cluster a group of symptoms with a particular genetic type, and then look at the actual gene SNPs, and then really look at the tests that confirm it. And then, like we always say, really be able to customize your recovery program at the hot spots, right? At the spots where you have the perfect storm of where those genetic SNPs and those epigenetic inhibitors take place. And John, that's a good segue in terms of what we're wanting to do is, starting in November, for those that purchased the course, we told them that we were going to have a 2-week, I believe, or just sort of their introductory
30-day trial.
Yeah, 30-day trial. I mean, we still have the other one for those that purchased the course initially. We got to still do that one. Mm-hmm. But a 30-day trial. And I think in that 30-day trial in our group, what we're going to be doing is talking about these nuances, right? Like doing a case study and showing, hey, this person had the Mthr, they were understimulated. We did a methylation panel. We were able to determine where it was broken down, because if they have multiple gene SNPs, it doesn't mean that it's going to be at this spot or that spot. We actually got to put the rubber to the road and figure out how it's playing out in this person's body. And then by understanding that, here's what we did and here's what the outcome was. And that really helps people now, not just, holds their hand and takes them through the algorithm of, okay, here's how we play, chess underwater 3D, right, as Bob Miller likes to speak about. Maybe the last thing we could talk about, John, I think it's a good thing in terms of an understimulated type. Tell us about what you put together here in terms of what would be the best dietary recommendation and why are histamines relevant in this case?
Yeah, so, certain genetic types have a specific diet that correlates to it. For instance, like the histamine type, which we're not talking about today, but there is a histamine genetic type. Obviously, a person that falls into a histamine genetic type issue is going to follow a low histamine diet. Okay. So the understimulated type, there's really no, set dietary component. Typically those people that are understimulated, they need protein because they need the building blocks, they need the amino acid. So, following a traditional AIP or paleo diet, a lot of times is a big consideration. Obviously, we want to restrict folic acid, in fortified foods, just because, the research shows that people with MTHFR, but specifically people with folate receptor issues, will have a higher tendency to not be able to metabolize folic acid in the diet very effectively. So it does add fuel to the fire, and it will block folate receptor sites, preventing the dietary folates from getting in. This is shown in the literature. So people that typically the understimulated type are the ones that really have to, really, really watch the folic acid in foods. I think all people should really, watch that, to be honest with you. But the people that are understimulated type really have to kind of hone into that more. But the reason typically I put people that are understimulated type on a lower histamine diet is because we talk about the first core genes with that, MTHFR and MTR. We talk a lot about methylation and methionine pathway today, which on a lot of these other genetic types, we don't. We really kind of downplay MTHFR is not a big player, but the understimulated type, MTHFR is a player. And so why a low histamine diet might be a better way to go is because you need methylation activity to control histamine. Okay. And so what I've seen a lot of times with patients that maybe they're not a histamine genetic type, but they are understimulated and they don't have a lot of methylation activity. So you look at a methylation profile and basically a lot of things are depleted. What happens is you are going to burn up a lot of SAMe, you're going to burn up a lot of riboflavins, you're going to burn up a lot of methylation activity to control histamine. So if you've got underlying gut infections, if you've got underlying, issues are going on, histamine a lot of times is kind of a tag along component to this. And so by going on a lower histamine diet, if you're the understimulated type, what you're actually doing is you're preserving methylation. You're preserving the need to help break down histamine from foods or some of that histamine that gets absorbed into the system. And now what happens, you've got more SAMe available. You've got more of those methylated B vitamins to do other things like produce energy, like regulate your neurochemistry better, and in turn, regulate your symptoms so you feel better. So usually with people that are understimulated type, I'll typically consider maybe a paleo or anti-inflammatory, but a lot of times if methylation is really impaired, and we know this through like a methylation profile, I will put them on a low histamine diet just to be able to preserve methylation activity so the body can use that to do other things.
Yeah, and I think the example I always use, John, I like the analogies, is that that's your major expense. If you have your income is your methylation, and you have some major weaknesses in your income ability, and then on top of that, you have some high expenses, and histamines can be released not just from the diet, but from stress and your immune system and the environment, like you've talked about, where living in Georgia, you get exposed to those pollens.
Right.
You have major expenses that, that ill-fated formula of having a low income and having a high cost of living doesn't bode well for just enjoying life in that way. And that same thing happens biochemically. So I think when you suggest a low histamine type diet, I think it really makes sense for those in the short term while they're getting their methylation on board and they're doing their due diligence and looking at what some of these major inhibitors are, paying the bills makes a whole lot of sense, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
So, okay. So then as far as any other words of wisdom for these understimulated, are you seeing some combinations of people that tend to have some low methylation activity with an understimulated presentation tend to be in another cluster of a genetic type? Because it's never really a pure breed, right? Where someone is just purely this or that. What are you seeing some bad combinations of?
Well, a lot of times when somebody is an understimulated type and they have that impaired methylation component, the first thing that you always think of is they're going to have impaired detox as well. And so a lot of times there's a correlation. We talk about, if somebody is multiple genetic types, right? Where if it's kind of like, symptomatically they're a mess and they can't really hone in which genetic type they are. One of the things you typically want to start with is either histamine, controlling that, which is controlling mast cell activation, which can really take the edge off. But then the other factor is the toxic accumulation genetic type, okay? Because if you got impaired methylation, you're typically going to have impaired detoxification aspects. So a lot of times those going hand in hand. And plus, we already talked about how chemicals and specifically heavy metals like mercury, lead, and aluminum is going to further in turn impair the understimulated type. So you kind of get in this vicious cycle where, okay, maybe you go into it where the understimulated type is the biggest priority, but because of that, you now can't detoxify, so accumulate toxins. And then now those toxins that you're accumulating, specifically heavy metals, are even putting more stress on the understimulated component. And then that's even impairing detoxification more. You get more exposure, that puts more stress, and you kind of do get in this vicious cycle component. So that's something I look at with a lot of patients. If I know they fall into the understimulated type, from an epigenetic standpoint, meaning the things that we're looking at that put traffic on the highway, there are a couple usual suspects. And one of the usual suspects is heavy metal burn, and so something I ask every single patient, if based on questionnaire aspects, they fall into this understimulated type, or if I have genetics in front of me and, based on their symptoms and the genetic profiles we see, they got a lot going on in these understimulated type based genes. My next question is, has heavy metals ever been checked? And if not, it's something that we definitely look at, because we want to determine how much traffic is on the highway and is causing the kind of that vicious cycle in terms of understimulating or underimpaired methylation activity, but also leading to an accumulation of toxins, and then that feeding, itself over and over and over again.
Yeah, and I think that's where, in a lot of cases, John, where you and I are taking over case studies that have already seen a bunch of different practitioners, and they know so many things and they're doing so many things. Maybe the last thing to speak of is the nuance of it all, or the sort of the zen and the art of balancing the pyramid, and how do you have the lowest minimal dosing, or the lowest minimal intervention with the highest maximal outcome without doing several different things. In this case, someone's an undermethylator, but they also have a toxic accumulation type because of epigenetic factors. Maybe speak about like the so-called paradox or Herxheiming reaction, and what the best approach to do in that instance in terms of priority, so that you avoid that kind of reaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of people, will have maybe tried detox components or done something for metals, or like really did something very aggressive, like, like IV chelation, which I really don't recommend. I think it's drinking from a fire hose and too much for a lot of people to tolerate. And we're starting to learn that, chelation and detox therapies, in itself can be something that can actually drive autoimmune process. You want to make sure you're doing it properly. But I think the missing factor a lot of times when you talk about like the detox or Herx reaction is not knowing the genetic aspect, not knowing going into it that you're a toxic accumulator, or you have these understimulated type based genes. Because the thing is, if you have, let's say, impaired MTR gene function, and let's say you've also got BHMT gene function, so you need a whole bunch of choline or betaine, to help that BHMT recycle homocysteine. Those are things you need to know to kind of, plug the holes, to kind of make sure that your biochemistry is working optimally. Because what happens if you start doing something here, and then further down the highway, that highway narrows down to one lane, and you don't know that, well, that in itself is going to drive that impaired detoxification, that Herxheimer effect. It's not so much that you're having a detox effect. Really what it tells us, there's something missing that you're not doing to allow traffic to flow from point A to point Z. And so a lot of times that's where understanding these genetic concepts, and especially this, understand what your genetic type is, because then you can support these things, knowing that you have, BHMT gene variants, you have MTHFR variants. And if you have like detox effects, most likely it's because those genetic components you have where the highway's narrowing down need more support to allow your biochemistry to become more efficient, so that things are working like a well-oiled machine.
Yeah, and I think that just goes to say, John, and you put me onto this path, is that we really don't work with anyone individually without having the genetic picture, right? Because we need that. And I think that people misunderstand that, because it's not one gene, right? We don't look at it, oh, you got the cancer gene, or you have the detox gene. It's the synergistic impact of all these genes, and categorizing it in a genetic type, and understanding, like you said, plugging up the holes, or doing the foundational things first, so that ultimately you're not 1 or 2 degrees off in the wrong direction, and yet so far. So lots of awesome nuggets in this one, John. So as far as, just give the listener a little bit of information. This is just sort of our outro in terms of where can they get the mini course and where can they go about getting the unlocked course?
Yeah, so we keep talking about your genetic type, and this is something we've been working on for a while now. And based on the things that we see in practice, some of the things that we've seen in research, that people fall into a core genetic type or types. And so what we've done is we've put together some educational series for people. So we have a free mini course for people where you can go and sign up, leave your email, and you get access to a video series that walks you through how to determine what your genetic type is. And then we've also done is we put together a your genetic type unlocked course. And what that is that's a paid course, $97, where you can actually take a course that's over 10 hours of content that walks you through what these genetic types are, what are the core genes, like we saw in this video where we kind of listed out the understimulated core genes. And then more importantly, what do you do about it? What's the core testing that each person for each genetic type should consider? And then what are the support recommendations? What are the dietary recommendations? What are the epigenetic factors that are the biggest stressors that go with each of those genetic types or those core genetic types? So it really kind of helps you narrow down the rabbit holes, because this genetic stuff can be very in-depth and it can be very, very confusing, and so what we've done is really streamlined it to really kind of, hone it in to determine which rabbit hole you got to go down. And then once you determine what rabbit hole you have to go down, these are the kind of bite-sized pieces or the baby steps you need to take to really understand how your genetic predisposition is a factor in your health concerns.
Yeah, and then ultimately for those, just for everyone who is anywhere along the continuum of I've never even heard of this, to I've done so many things and I know that something's missing, or anyone in between. And then last, like we said, included in that purchase is a free 30-day trial to our membership site. And that membership site will be a paid low cost monthly subscription, where you'll have the group, the Facebook group, where you'll be able to do case studies where we'll go through and hold your hand and explain to you, like look over our shoulder kind of thing, in terms of this is how we work up a case. This is this particular type. This were the tests that we did. These were the suggestions and even questions as well. So that's an awesome tool as well to start here shortly. And that's it, John. Awesome presentation today. I guess next week we will do the heavy metal talk.
All right, sounds great.
All right, awesome. I'll talk to you soon, and everyone else have an awesome rest of your day. Take care.